The Icebound Retreat. Last winter, my friends and I decided to rent a secluded cabin deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be the perfect winter getaway. No phones, no distractions, just us, the snow, and a roaring fireplace. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for: snowball fights, lazy mornings by the fire, and long talks over cups of hot cocoa. But on the third morning, something changed. I woke up to a strange, heavy silence. When I pulled back the curtains, my stomach dropped. The snow was gone. In its place was ice, smooth, glass-like ice stretching endlessly in every direction. The trees, which had stood tall and snow-covered the night before, were now frozen solid, their branches encased in thick frost, glinting like crystal in the morning light. I called for the others, and soon we were all standing by the windows, staring in disbelief. The ice didn't look natural. It shimmered faintly, almost as if it was alive. We decided to leave, but the moment we stepped outside, we realized we were trapped. The ice was too slippery to walk on, and it stretched far beyond the cabin's property. Worse, as we stared down, we began to see shapes beneath the surface. At first, they looked like shadows, but soon we realized they weren't. They were faces. The first one I saw clearly was a man, his face twisted in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. Another figure, a woman, was reaching upward, her hand frozen just inches from the surface. Everywhere we looked, there were more, frozen figures, perfectly preserved beneath the ice. Panic set in. Derek, always the impulsive one, decided to try to make it to the main road. We begged him to stay, but he grabbed a flashlight and ventured out into the icy expanse. We watched him struggle, slipping and stumbling, until he vanished into the distance. Hours passed, and he didn't come back. That night, the cabin grew unbearably cold. As the temperature plummeted, the ice outside began to crack. Not in a random way, but in deliberate, intricate patterns. It spread like veins, radiating outward. We could hear it shifting, groaning under some immense pressure. Worse, the frozen figures beneath seemed to be moving. Not much, just enough to make us doubt what we were seeing. A hand tilted slightly. A face turned. Their eyes, lifeless and glassy, felt like they were watching us. We stayed awake all night, huddled together by the fire. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, everything was normal again. The ice was gone, replaced by fresh snow, soft and untouched. But Derek was still missing, and the terror in my friends' eyes told me they'd seen the same horrors I had. We left that morning, abandoning everything but the clothes on our backs. Weeks later, I searched for answers. I found an old article about a group of settlers who had vanished in that area centuries ago during an unrelenting winter. Their bodies were never found, and locals believed the ice had claimed them, trapping their souls beneath its surface. Even now, when I close my eyes on cold nights, I see those faces beneath the ice. And sometimes, just for a moment, I wonder if one day I'll join them. Frostbite Lodge. It started last January, during one of the coldest winters I can remember. I had just inherited a ski lodge from a distant relative I barely knew, a place called Frostbite Lodge. The name alone should have been a warning. The lodge was nestled high in the mountains, a sprawling timber-frame structure that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a postcard. It had been abandoned for decades, and I figured I could fix it up, maybe turn it into a vacation rental or even live there part-time. The thought of owning a place like that felt surreal. The drive up was breathtaking. Winding roads flanked by towering pines and blankets of snow. But as I rounded the final bend and saw the lodge for the first time, something about it gave me pause. The windows were dark and lifeless, and the heavy snow on the roof seemed to weigh the whole place down, like it was bowing under some invisible burden. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew. The furniture was covered with white sheets, like the place had been hastily abandoned. But what caught my attention was a framed photo hanging in the lobby. It showed a group of smiling people dressed in 1950s ski gear, posed in front of the lodge. Written beneath it were the words, "Final Season, Winter, 1959. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that first night, as I sat by the fire in the main lounge, I swear I heard whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. I brushed it off as the wind or the old building settling, but the unease lingered. The next morning I found something strange. In the hallway outside the guest rooms, there were faint footprints in the frost that had crept in through a broken window. They were barefoot, the size of an adult's, and led straight to one of the locked rooms. I checked the door. It was still bolted shut, and when I peered through the keyhole, all I could see was darkness. The following nights got worse. The whispers grew louder, and they weren't coming from outside. They were in the walls, surrounding me, shifting from one side of the room to the other. Sometimes I could make out words, fragments of sentences. They never left. Or help us. One night, as I was exploring the upstairs hallway, I noticed frost creeping along the baseboards. It was strange because the fireplace had been roaring for hours. The frost seemed to spread toward the same locked guest room. This time I couldn't resist. I forced the door open, and the air inside was colder than the outside. The room was empty except for an old bed and a wardrobe. But then I noticed the floor. It was covered in ice, and frozen into it were faces. I froze. They weren't clear, but I could see distorted expressions of terror staring back at me, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, slammed the door shut, and fled to the lobby. That's when I saw it. The photo of the guests from 1959. Only this time, it was different. Their faces were no longer smiling. They were the same twisted, horrified faces I had seen in the ice. I didn't stay another night. I packed a bag and left before dawn, skidding down the icy mountain roads as fast as my car would take me. I don't know what happened at Frostbite Lodge, and I don't want to know. The whispers, the footprints, the faces, they haunt me. But what keeps me awake at night is this. I checked that guest room door before I left, and it was bolted shut again from the inside. Snowed-in spirits. Last winter, my partner and I decided to get away from the city for a while. Work had been hectic, and we were desperate for some peace and quiet. We booked a last-minute stay at a quaint little inn we'd found online, nestled in a remote valley. It looked charming in the photos. Wood-paneled walls, a roaring fireplace, and snow-covered hills stretching as far as the eye could see. The drive there was treacherous. The snowstorm hit harder than expected, and by the time we pulled up to the inn, it was already dark. The building was exactly as described, cozy, inviting, and glowing warmly against the snowy backdrop. A woman greeted us at the door, introducing herself as Eleanor, the innkeeper. She had this old-fashioned charm about her, like someone from a different era. "You're lucky you made it before the storm got worse," she said with a smile, ushering us inside. The interior was as charming as the pictures had promised. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of something sweet, cinnamon maybe, hung in the air. There were a few other guests, seated quietly in the lounge, sipping drinks or reading by the fire. Eleanor showed us to our room. It was simple but comfortable, with antique furniture and a large window overlooking the snowy woods. "Dinner will be ready shortly," she said before leaving us to settle in. At dinner, we joined the other guests in the dining room. They were polite but eerily quiet. No one spoke unless spoken to, and even then their responses were short, almost robotic. What struck me most was how pale they looked, their skin nearly translucent under the dim lighting. After dinner, my partner and I retreated to our room. "Did you notice how weird everyone was?" they whispered. I nodded. trying to shake off the unease. That night, I woke up to the sound of muffled voices. At first, I thought it was coming from the lounge, but when I got up to check, the hallways were empty. The inn was silent, except for the faint creaking of the old floorboards beneath my feet. As I turned to head back, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, at the end of the hallway. A pale figure standing still, barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as I stared, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the shadows, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it disappeared into one of the rooms. The next morning, the storm had worsened. Eleanor informed us that the roads were impassable and we'd have to stay another night. "You're safe here," she reassured us, but her words felt more like a warning. Throughout the day, the other guests became even stranger. They didn't eat, didn't speak, and barely acknowledged our presence. At one point, I noticed one of them sitting completely still in the lounge staring at the fire. When I passed by an hour later, they hadn't moved an inch. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the room felt heavy, and the whispers returned, closer this time. My partner was already awake, staring at the ceiling. "We need to leave," they whispered. We packed our things and headed downstairs, hoping to sneak out. But as we reached the front door, Eleanor appeared, blocking our path. "You can't leave," she said softly, her smile eerily calm. "The storm is too dangerous." I glanced back at the lounge. The guests were all there, standing in a perfect line, their pale faces turned toward us. Their eyes were empty, lifeless. That's when it hit me. They weren't guests. They were spirits. Eleanor hadn't been hosting travelers. She'd been collecting them. We didn't wait to find out what she had planned for us. We shoved past her and ran into the storm. The snow was blinding, the cold biting through our clothes, but adrenaline kept us moving. When we finally reached the main road, we flagged down a plow truck and begged the driver to take us back to town. I don't know how we made it out, but I haven't stopped thinking about that night. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has stumbled upon that inn, lured in by its charm, only to become part of Eleanor's collection. And sometimes in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear those whispers.